years ago, Marg Kutz came to us as senior pastor and served us for 18? Okay, and served us for 10 years. In her retirement, she has written a book. And so now she is going to tell us about the book, about her journey as a Virginia Conference United Methodist clergy woman and Abu Khloy, mission to South Sudan. So if you will welcome Marg Kutz.
Thanks, Susan. Oh, here's the remote. Okay. Thank you for allowing me to be here today. It's going to be fun. Some of you helped with this book. Ruth Boyd was one of the people I called and asked about transportation because she used to work at the toll booth, you know, when there was a toll road between Richmond and Petersburg. So she was able to tell me a little bit more about how all of that worked. One of the things I discovered is that there isn't really much written about women. As you know this phrase, history belongs to the victor. Mm-hmm. Or history belongs to those who wrote it. Well, the women, you know, the victor was generally white men, frankly, and always men, and most of the time white. And so that's one of the reasons we have Black History Month and Women's History Month, so that we can have their histories as well as the victor's history. And certainly this was true of Lillian Russell and Mildred Long. Their history was nowhere in Methodist history here in Virginia. I did find a history of first 100 years of United Methodist Women in Virginia, and I found that it was written by a woman named Kathy Morgan, one of our historians who just died recently. And all she had was some correspondence that she had with Mildred and Lillian, and it was 2 pages. And basically, they gave her the facts, and they said, we never really encountered any hardships because we were women, and the ones we did, and Mildred said, well, there was some, but the ones we had, God got us through. And so it's just sort of glossed over, which is a tendency for women to do, you know, because we're here to make everything okay. Yeah, Mama's here, everything's going to be all right. And so we tend to tell our own stories that way. Oh, it was hard, but it was okay. And frankly, it wasn't okay. You know, what happened to them. So it was in, well, and then I just mentioned this. This was true of Lillian and Mildred. They were not the victors. They did not write the history because they were too busy making history to have the time to write it. So it was in October of 2017 that I had a dream. And in the dream, I was asked to tell the story of Lillian Russell and Mildred Long. Now, I didn't know these women, but I knew their names. They were the clergy women who were in the conference, you know, as I was coming in. But I really knew very little about them. And I mentioned just those 2 pages in the history of United Methodist Women. So I started right away with research, and I sort of figured I'd do like a year research and write a book in a year. But I never had written a book before, so I didn't know how it worked. But I thought, okay, 2 years, this should go pretty well. But the history was hard to dig up because it wasn't, you know, I went to typical places, Methodist archives. We have some up in Richmond, we have some at Randolph-Macon. But where I got more research was places like Ancestry.com, newspapers.com, with interviews with some of their former parishioners. And I went to their churches. I had a very difficult time with Blandford, but Mildred's churches, some of them were closed, but some of them I was able to find things. It's really important for churches to maintain their history. And so often the people will go through and say, well, these are old papers, and just throw them out. But that's your history. So the churches that had saved their history were really helpful to me. They had all of their charge conferences, because the districts don't keep the charge conferences. They count on local churches doing it. So I could go back through and read through those and sort of see what some of the issues were and how these two women managed them. I talked to former parishioners. I was able to find a little bit of family for each one of them. I talked to some colleagues, clergy who were ministers around that time, probably young ministers when they were Lily and Mildred were more seasoned ministers, but I was able to talk to some of them. And I found that I had a follow-up on every lead, that God led me to the information I needed if I just paid attention and followed up on every lead. Some of them led to nothing, some of them just led to the next thing I needed to follow up with. But what I learned through all of this is that Lily and Mildred were two of the most amazing women that I had never met. Yeah, just incredible. I was just in awe of them as I uncovered more and more. Their story really is compelling, and I was not surprised that God said somebody has got to tell their story. This can't stay hidden under this bushel basket any longer. And I'm going to call on Cynthia later, but I want to tell this story of Mildred and Lillian, and then she actually knew them, so she's going to talk a little bit about that. But let me just do this part first. Character development in a story is really important. Because when you read a book, you want to enter into the lives of the people that are in the book, and you do that through character development. Plus, their story started when they were young, and for Lillian at age 17 and for Mildred at age 21, and followed them all the way up till their death. So they can't be, as a teenager, who they were in their 70s. There's got to be some development. So I worked on that, but Lillian was especially challenging because everybody I talked to said she was a saint. They couldn't think of anything even human about her, let alone negative about her. And so it was somewhat similar with Mildred, but it was a little bit easier for her. But it was a little bit like writing Little House on the Prairie or The Waltons or a Hallmark script, where it's all it's like a little bit of shaky music, and then it's all going to be okay. So I had to humanize, particularly I had to really work at humanizing Lillian, because frankly, when you read a book, if a person is too saintly, you don't really like them. They're just too good. Yeah, they're just too good to be true. So, I had to sort of rough Lillian up a little bit with a little sandpaper. And part of that was character development, where I started when she was younger, and so she surely had some teenage attributes. She wasn't always, how she was when she was older. Lillian was born in 1914, and she was one of 7 children born to E.W. and Goldie Russell.
She's the one on the left.
Yeah. Somebody said they figured that out when they looked at the picture carefully. They could see her watch into her jacket, and I said, "Oh, that's a good way of doing that." This was Lillian's father, E.W. Russell. They were a very religious family, and they were active at Highland Park Methodist Church in Richmond. It closed recently, but some of you may be familiar with that large church in Richmond, one-time large church in Richmond. When Lillian was a very young child, she got sick and nearly died, and I heard that story, but I wondered if it wasn't the Spanish flu of 1918, because she would have been about 4 years old then, and wondered if that isn't what she got. And her father promised God that if his daughter lived, he would be sure she dedicated her life to the work of Christ. Now, Lillian skipped 3 grades in school, which wasn't uncommon in those times. So she was 15 when she graduated from high school, and she was looking for purpose and adventure. And it came at the age of 17 when a Methodist pastor invited her to be an evangelist at his church for a 2-week revival. Can you imagine? Picture yourself at age 17 and somebody asks you to preach on Youth Sunday, but that's one thing. But to preach every night at a 2-week revival at another church. And so the newspapers were all over that revival, and the newspapers were extremely helpful because they repeatedly had articles about these 2 women because they were unusual in their neighborhoods and the things that they did. And as Lillian started as an evangelist, this was really interesting to them. It was a really successful worship services, those 2 weeks, and a lot of people came to Christ through it, and as a result of that, then more and more people asked her, and I found lots of newspaper articles. Just from the newspaper articles, I had a full page listed of dates when she had been an evangelist somewhere. You know, what church it was and sort of what the dates were. She was very popular. And she did this for more than 10 years. This is a picture of her as a young woman, as an evangelist. So she did this for more than 10 years. She traveled throughout Virginia, North Carolina, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. There was a woman named Mary Gills. You know, women couldn't travel by themselves. It wasn't considered safe. It wasn't considered appropriate. You know, it just, woman by herself, not only could somebody harm her, but she looked like she was looking for somebody to harm her. That was sort of the thinking at the time. But there was a preacher in Maryland who had her up there for a 2-week revival and invited her back the next year for a 6-week revival. Well, that is just like unheard of. So it was 2 weeks at one church, then the next 2 weeks at another church, and then another 2 weeks then in Pennsylvania. So she did that, and then people began to refer to her instead of the child evangelist or the teen evangelist or the woman evangelist. It was the 6-week revival evangelist. That was sort of then, you know, her new title. And because she couldn't go by herself, Mary Gills was a person that traveled with her. And initially, when I knew that Mary Gills had been her roommate when she lived in the parsonage in Petersburg, and continued to be a good friend right up until her death. But so I introduced Mary when the parsonage was built, and Lillian needed a roommate. But then when I went to Cumberland, Maryland, and did my research there, and their historical research was at a college there, but I was allowed to go in and use that. Then I saw Mary Gill's name in the newspaper that she had gone with Lillian, so I had to change, and I did that regularly, where I'd write something based on what I knew, and then I found better information, more information, and I'd have to rewrite it to reflect that. So I had her go with her for those 6 weeks. And then while Lillian was an evangelist for those 10 years, she used her parents' house as sort of her base because Lillian never drove. And one of her former parishioners said, she told us one time that she had an accident when she was young and trying to learn how to drive, and she just never drove after that. So there's a chapter in the book that just talks about, first I wrote the chapter, and it was her father who was trying to teach her how to drive. And then I found out from a niece's husband that it wasn't the father that taught her how to drive, but it was her brother. So then I had to go back and rewrite that again. It was some kind of thing, you know, where I'd get more reason. I tried to make it as accurate as I could. So, as far as I could tell from the newspapers, she didn't get a lot of resistance, but again, it was based on interviews that she had with these reporters. And because Lillian and Mildred were notorious for sort of toning things down, you didn't know if they had resistance or not. And it just made sense to me that they did. I couldn't imagine that they could walk into a church, go to the pulpit, read scripture, proclaim the gospel without people going, she shouldn't even be up there. Their woman's not supposed to be there, and quoting Timothy, you know, all that sort of thing. So I put some of the conflict in there because that made perfect sense to me that would have happened. So when she came home from the 6-week revival, she wanted a license to preach. And that's a title that we have in the Methodist Church. It seems sort of strange, like why would you need a license to preach? You might need a license to drive or to practice medicine or whatever, but to preach, why would you need a license? But anyways, it's just one of the terms we have. And it's supposed to have some training and ongoing education in order to do that. So she came back from the 6-week revival and tried to get a license to preach. And she was on the Richmond district as being part of Highland Park. But the newspaper said that she had gotten it in Rappahannock. But then our records show that she was a licensed preacher in the Richmond district. So I thought, how did that happen? So, you know, in my mind, I'm thinking, well, probably the Richmond district superintendent didn't want, because that woman had never been licensed to preach in Virginia, didn't want that to happen on his district. So she went to the Rappahannock district. So one of the people that I talked to, referred to a lot, is a long retired pastor named Raymond Wren, who is now over 100 years old. And that man's mind is like a steel trap. He remembers everything. Everything. He he told me the first time he remembered seeing a pastor in a robe. Where he was, how old he was. Anyway, so I went to him and he said, oh, well, that's because the DS, wouldn't allow that to happen, and it probably happened regularly, and then she just went to a neighboring. And I knew that her father would have gone with her, because even when I was interviewed for deacon's orders, my husband went with me because that was the practice. That if you were married, your spouse, well, it was only men, if you were married, your wife went with you. So anyways, so I had her father go with her on all of these, all the hoops that she had to get through. So shortly after being licensed, then she was asked to serve as the pastor at Blandford, and that is not the Blandford church that you all know about in Petersburg. The one with the Tiffany windows is not that one. Because for a long time I thought, oh, that must be where she was now. Where she was is now torn down, so it's no longer standing. 95 came through and really disrupted the neighborhood that she served there. But she went there, was asked to go there to Blandford. It was a little church started by Washington Street, and really they sent her there to close it. And I remember hearing that story when I heard about Lily, and they sent her there to close it. Because it had been a financial burden on the conference for years, and I was reading about that in various conference history things. But instead of growing the church, she grew it. She grew it in numbers and in finance and in ministry. And so then the book continues to tell the story of her serving as a pastor at Blandford. Let me get a little bit more here. It's a picture of her as a young woman outside of the church. And her struggles that she had to be ordained a deacon and then an elder. So she was the first woman, there's Blandford, the old Blandford church that now no longer stands. Sort of a standard design for that. Tells her story and her struggles to be ordained a deacon and an elder. So she was the first woman in Virginia, and that's Mary Gills. And look how short Lillian is compared to Mary, because she's still shorter than Mary, and Mary's a step lower. Look how thin people were then, too. Isn't that amazing? I look back at those pictures and I said, whoa, we had America gotten a little bit bigger. But anyways, McDonald's, all of that. So she was the first in 4 things. She was the first to get a license to preach, first female in Virginia to get a license to preach, and to get an appointment, and those both happened in 1944 when she was 30 years old. So she had finished her time, as an evangelist, and did that. And then she was ordained a deacon in 1947, and she was ordained an elder in 1949. So she was the first female in all 4 of those categories. And she did all of that between ages 30 and 35. So once she started, she just kept going. Then the book moves to tell the story of Mildred Long. Let me see if there's anything else. There's Mildred and Lillian together as younger women outside of Blandford Church. Lillian also was born in 1914, so the same year that Lillian was born. They were the same age. She was from a family of 12 children. She was from a little place called Biscoe, North Carolina. I went there and researched their library and found some distant relative. I was glad I did, because he had done a family genealogy, and then he died the next summer in a car accident, so I was glad I found him when I did. Mildred grew up there in Biscoe, but she came to Virginia when she was 21 to the Dan River Mills. And do you know anything about mill towns? That was fascinating. I spent a whole day over in Danville and interviewed people and looked through there. They have a museum there, and they allowed me to go through their records and stuff. And I really think that helped to shape Mildred. I think her personality was already there, but just sort of her experience there and the role that women played, and she was able to exercise a lot of leadership in different things. So I spent a fair amount of time talking about Mildred at Dan River Mills, and I was in a writer group, and they said, this is more information than we need. It's taking away from the story, so unless this is really important later on, you need to take it out. So I left some in, I left the majority in, but I did take some out. Eventually they say, but it's your book, you do what you want, but I think you're wrong. So, there was a woman at the Methodist Church in Danville, after Mildred had been there several years, noticed Mildred's many abilities and paid her way through college. It was Columbia College, Bible College in South Carolina. And so that's all I knew. She had shared that in an interview with a newspaper reporter. So, and, you know, if you're doing a historical fiction, you take what you know, and then you create scenes, and you create dialogue, and you make it into a story. So as you read it, it's based on information that I found, as far as I know, is factual. But the stories themselves and the conversations and those kind of things, I don't really know if her father went with her, and I don't know what the meeting would have gone like, and I don't know what role the bishop played. But I got the most information I could get and put it together in a way that made sense to me, anyways. So she did that, went away to South Carolina, and she came back to the mill and worked again. And the war played a big part in this, because that's partly how Lily got her appointment, because all the men were in the military. And then, same thing with Mildred. So she was asked to take an appointment, and she did. So the newspaper said she was the second woman in Virginia to receive an appointment, and that was in 1950, and by then Mildred was 36 years old. And at some point early on, they became good friends, because you can tell from the pictures. So I just made it happen as soon as Mildred got her first appointment. And some of you may know, I know Cynthia does, but I have a good friend in ministry almost from the beginning named Rita Callis. And so her friendship that spanned all those years, our friendship together, spanned all those years, became sort of the, I don't know, the example, the model that I use for, because Rita and I were very different people, and did ministry differently and that sort of thing, but we're very good friends, and so sort of use that as a model for how friendship might be over the course of a lifetime. And I don't think they could have, Mildred in particular, I don't know how she would have done this without her friendship with Lillian. Lillian had tremendous family support, and if you've read the book, it's just over and over again, you know, how her family just is so involved. When I heard that her mother rode the bus with her from their home in Richmond down to Petersburg, and Ruth helped me know that there would have been various connections and such, and went with her to visit parishioners, I thought, this is a family who was deeply involved with this young woman, with their daughter. So I think she was well provided for with family support, but Mildred didn't have that. And I think without Lillian, it would have been very difficult for her. There was a bishop in Virginia that was here for 16 years, which now isn't allowed, you can only serve 8. But Bishop Peel was here for 16 years, and I think he made a real difference indeed for these two women. He helped them get appointments, and as Mildred shared some of her story, because she was more likely to share that with reporters, and then sort of tell what didn't go well, but then say, but it all worked out okay. Anyways, I went back, and Peel was a part of that, part of many of those good things that happened. So Mildred then, the only first that was left, and this may not make a lot of sense to you, so let me just back up. You know, we used to have 2 ordinations, deacon and elder. That's I came in under that, Cynthia came in under that. But they don't do that anymore, because it was sort of like, you know, half down and hold down. I mean, are you ordained or not? I mean, it's ordained, it was sort of wonky. So they changed it. Yeah, it's just a different wonk now. But being there was 2 relationships. There were 2 status. One had statuses. One had to do with ordination status. The other one had to do with membership to the conference. It's sort of like, I think it'd be a little bit like a professor at a school, that you can be hired and you can be on staff there, but you're not tenured. And it takes certain things to be tenured. And there was a long time when women really couldn't be tenured at a lot of universities. You know, they could maybe teach or be assistant, but they couldn't do that. So with the Methodists, being in full connection, being a full member of the conference was like, anyways, that's sort of the epitome. And it wasn't even allowed. It's permanent, yes. And the big thing with being full connection is that you're guaranteed an appointment. And the idea is that if I say, okay, it's time for me to leave here, and the church says, oh yeah, it's more than time for you to leave here. And then, so I throw my hat in the ring, right? Yeah. But if you have, but I'm guaranteed that somebody's going to take that hat, and that I'm going to still have a job. so that I'm not just throwing it out there and I might, you know, come June, might not have a place to live or not. So being in full connection is what guaranteed that somebody was going to take your hat and you were going to have a job. And that's what was denied women until 1956. So women could be ordained an elder, but they could not be in full connection. So in 1956, the whole denomination met and they changed that so women could be accepted. So Lillian was not interested because she never wanted to leave Blandford. So she didn't really care about full connection. But Mildred was itinerating, so every time she moved to another church, she was taking a chance that she might not get a church, which meant she probably would have had to move back home to North Carolina because it wasn't like she had another income that was going to support her. And they never paid her enough that she could ever save much money. She, you know, because it wasn't like she could, you know, anyways. So
She didn't have to support the family.
she didn't have the support of her family very much.
No, she didn't have to support the family, so they didn't.
Oh, gotcha, yeah. Oh, I see what you're saying. Yes. Yeah, she didn't have, yeah. Yeah, because I ran into that too, when they didn't want to increase my salary because I had a husband that had a career, so mine was just supplemental. I thought, oh, I didn't know you were involved in my family finances. So Mildred wanted that. She wanted full connection. And she tried to get it when she was one of her appointments, Bellevue, and I think it was the Danville district. And they wouldn't do anything with it. This is what I read in an article where she was interviewed and, you know, she told the reporter. So the bishop moved her to a different district, the Fredericksburg district, where she was, where the DS was more amenable to this. So she moved there, and eventually then she was brought into full connection.